The day Louisa Talbot rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she did it with a rifle across her saddle, a scowl carved into her face like it had been put there by a chisel, and not a single soul in the town who dared ask her name first. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of everything, perched on the Kansas and Indian Territory border like a man balanced on a fence post, not quite sure which side he wanted to fall toward. The cattle drive still pushed through in those years, kicking up red dust along the Kishom Trail, and the town itself had grown fast and mean, the way frontier towns did when money and desperation arrived in equal measure. There were 3 saloons, a livery stable, a general store run by a man named Horace Prout who weighed his flour like he was measuring gold, a small church that held services only when the circuit preacher came through, and a boarding house operated by a widow named Mrs. Clara Finch, who believed strongly in clean sheets and the power of a hot supper to settle a troubled soul. Louisa Talbot was 26 years old, and she had a face that might have been called beautiful if it had not been arranged so deliberately into an expression that discouraged all comment. Her dark hair was pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat. Her eyes were the color of winter river water, gray-green and very still, and they moved over a room the way a hawk's eyes moved over a field, measuring, cataloging, deciding what was worth attention and what was not. She wore practical clothes, a canvas coat, riding trousers that scandalized Mrs. Finch on first sight, and boots that had seen 1,000 miles of hard use. She paid for a room at the boarding house in cash. She did not explain where she had come from or where she intended to go. She asked only whether there was a cattle operation nearby that was hiring, because she had been told she was the best horsebreaker west of Wichita, and she had every intention of being paid what that skill was worth. Mrs. Finch, who had a talent for restraining her questions until they had fermented into something she could not help releasing, managed to hold herself for approximately 4 hours before she appeared at Louisa's door with a tray of supper, and the news that the Boone Ranch, about 6 miles east of town, was in fact the largest cattle operation in the county, and that the owner, one Lionel Boone, had been asking around about someone who could work with difficult horses. "He lost his head wrangler in August," Mrs. Finch said, setting the tray down with the careful deliberateness of a woman who was really just buying time to observe. "Threw his back out roping a bull. Poor man can barely walk. Lionel Mr. Boone, he's been managing with his regular hands, but there are a string of horses he bought out of a lot from New Mexico that nobody has been able to do much with." Louisa ate her supper without comment. She ate with efficiency and economy, the way a person eats who has not always been sure where the next meal was coming from. Then she looked up at Mrs. Finch. "What kind of man is he?" she asked. Mrs. Finch considered this. "The kind that keeps his word," she said finally, "which around here counts for more than most things." Louisa nodded once, finished her supper, and went to sleep. She rode out to the Boone Ranch the following morning before the sun had fully committed to rising. The land out there was broad and flat in places, rolling in others, the grass gone golden brown with the season, and the sky above it was the enormous pale blue that only ever seemed to exist properly in the west, where there was enough horizon to let it breathe. She found the ranch without difficulty. It was the kind of operation that announced itself before you arrived, the white fencing visible from a quarter mile, the barn larger than most buildings she had seen in the town she had passed through, the main house built solid and square with a wide porch running across its front face. She was halfway down the lane when a man came out of the barn and stood watching her approach. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the October chill, and he had the kind of unhurried stillness about him that she associated with men who had been tested and had come through the testing without needing to advertise the fact. His hat was brown and plain. His jaw carried several days of dark stubble. He was perhaps 30 or thereabouts, and he watched her ride toward him with an expression of frank assessment that did not tip over into anything inappropriate. "You would be Lionel Boone," she said when she pulled up her horse. "I would," he said, "and you are not the man I was expecting. I was not aware you had specified." He considered this for a moment, then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. "That is fair," he said. "Get down and let me see your hands." She swung off the horse with practiced ease and held out her hands, palms up. They were not soft hands. They were the hands of someone who had worked with rope and leather and horsehide for years, the palms calloused in the specific places that said she was telling the truth about what she did. He looked at them without touching them, then raised his eyes to hers. "You have broken horses before." "I have gentled horses," she said. "There is a difference. I do not break them. I work with them until they understand they can trust a person. It takes longer. The results last." He studied her for another moment. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the barn. The morning light was beginning to warm the tops of the fence posts and turn them copper. "The string I bought has 7 horses," he said. "All of them are green and most of them are frightened. One of them bit my best hand last week. What would you charge?" She named a price that was fair and slightly above what most ranches would have expected to pay, because she had learned that asking for fair wages was not greed but self-respect, and that men who offered to pay less than work was worth were telling you something important about themselves. He did not flinch. "Done," he said. "You will need a place to stay while the work is ongoing." "Mrs. Finch's?" "Yes. I can arrange for a horse for the daily ride back and forth if yours needs rest." "My horse does not need rest." He nodded, and this time the precursor to a smile became the actual thing, brief and genuine and contained. "All right," he said. "Come and meet the horses." She followed him into the paddock behind the barn, and that was how it began, not with anything dramatic or declared, but with 2 people standing at a fence rail watching a frightened roan mare pace the far corner, and the man saying quietly, "Her name is Cassidy and she does not trust anyone," and the woman saying, equally quiet, "Neither do I, and yet here we are," and the man turning to look at her with an expression that contained surprise and something else she could not quite name. Something that moved too fast for her to catch and hold. She worked the horses for 6 days before she said more than a dozen words to Lionel Boone that were not strictly about the animals. She arrived early, worked methodically, spoke to the horses in low, even tones, and spent long stretches of time simply standing in the paddock, not asking anything of them, letting them grow accustomed to her presence. It was not a technique that impressed at first glance. Several of the ranch hands watched her with skepticism. A man named Pete, who had ridden for the Boone Ranch for 3 years, told another hand named Walt that he reckoned she was being paid to stand around doing nothing, and Walt said he didn't know about that, but he noticed the horses seemed calmer already. On the 3rd day, the roan mare Cassidy came to her. Just walked across the paddock on her own initiative and dropped her head and pressed her nose against Louisa's shoulder, and Louisa stood very still and breathed slowly and let it happen. Lionel saw this from the barn doorway. He said nothing, but he watched for a long time. On the 6th day, he brought 2 cups of coffee out to the paddock fence in the late morning, and he handed one to her over the top rail without ceremony or explanation, and she took it the same way, and they stood for a while watching the bay gelding she had been working that morning move around the paddock in loose, easy circles. "Where did you come from?" he asked, not prying. Genuinely curious, with the kind of curiosity that was patient and could have waited. "Missouri originally," she said, "then here and there for a while. On your own, mostly." He did not push, he sipped his coffee. The bay gelding changed direction and trotted along the far fence with something approaching confidence. "He is doing well," Lionel said. "He needed someone to be consistent with him," she said. "They all do, something that does not change." He glanced at her and she was looking at the horse, and he turned back to look at the horse too. "That is true of most things," he said. She did not reply, but she did not move away from the fence rail either, and the 2 of them stood there together until the coffee was finished, and she handed the empty cup back over the rail and went back to work. It was Mrs. Finch who first ventured a comment. On the seventh evening, as Louisa came back to the boarding house and sat down to supper, Mrs. Finch put a plate of roasted chicken and boiled potatoes in front of her and said, without preamble, "Lionel Boone is a good man." "You mentioned," Louisa said. "He has been alone since his wife passed, Mrs." Finch continued, settling into the chair across the table with the calm of a woman who had decided this conversation was happening whether or not it was invited. 3 years ago, she was a sweet girl, Eleanor. Fever took her very sudden. Louisa cut her chicken with precision. "I am sorry to hear it. He has not well. He has not looked at anyone since. Most of the women in this town have tried. He is not unkind about it, but he is not interested either." Mrs. Finch folded her hands on the table. "Until lately, some of the hands say he has been, I believe the word they used was distracted." Louisa looked up. "I am here to work with his horses, Mrs. Finch." "Of course you are, dear," said Mrs. Finch, and picked up her fork with the serene expression of a woman who had said exactly what she intended to say and needed to add nothing further. The thing was, and Louisa would not have said this to Mrs. Finch or to anyone else, she had noticed him too. She had noticed the way he moved through his ranch with a kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. She had noticed that he treated his hands decently, remembered their names, asked about their families. She had noticed that he spent an hour in the evenings on the porch with a book, and that he brought his own coffee to his own fence rather than sending someone else to do it, and that when the roan mare Cassidy had come to Louisa on the third day, he had looked at it like he was watching something that mattered. She had noticed all of this, and she had filed it away in the place where she kept things that were not allowed to become feelings, and she had gone on working. The noticing was the problem. It had always been the problem. She had loved a man once 8 years ago in Missouri, when she was 18, and had not yet learned what she later came to understand. His name was Thomas Reardon, and he had been charming and certain, and had made her feel, for almost a year, that the world was an arranged and generous place. Then he had taken the money she had saved from 2 years of household work, told her he was going to buy them a future, and ridden away. She had waited 6 months before she accepted that he was not coming back. By the time that acceptance arrived, she had already begun the work of becoming someone who would not be made a fool of that way again. She had been good at the work. She had made herself capable and self-sufficient and unreadable. She had gone to work with horses because they were honest. They responded to what you actually were, not what you presented, and they had no interest in charming you. She had moved from place to place, collecting skills and refusing attachments, and she had been largely successful in constructing a life that could not be taken from her because it did not depend on anyone else. It had been, she thought sometimes in the nights, a very safe and very lonely life. She did not let herself think that too often. On the 10th day she was at the Boone Ranch. A situation arose that changed the quality of everything between them. It happened in the afternoon when she was working with the last of the 7 horses, a black stallion that had been the most difficult of the string. He had been badly mishandled before. She could see it in the way he held himself, the specific quality of his wariness, and she had been careful and slow with him, earning his trust in fractions of inches. She was in the paddock with him, moving slowly in a wide circle, when the latch on the paddock gate failed. It was a thing that should have been repaired. The wood was rotted at the post. She had noticed it and had meant to mention it, and the gate swung open, and the black stallion, who had been building toward calm, was suddenly terrified by the creak of it and bolted. He went through the gate and across the open yard and toward the south fence, and Louisa went after him without hesitating, not running in a panicked way but moving fast and deliberate, reading his trajectory. He was heading for the corner where the fencing angled, and she knew that if he hit it at speed he would hurt himself badly. She did not have time to get in front of him. But she was close enough on his right flank that she could have angled him, and she lifted her arms and moved into his path just enough, and called out to him in the low, even tone she had been using for 10 days, and the stallion heard her voice and checked, just for a second, just enough, and turned and ran along the fence instead of into it. It was Lionel who caught him at the far end, appearing as if from nowhere, moving out from behind the water trough with a rope and a calmness that matched hers, and the stallion slowed because he was tired, and because there were two people on either side of him who were not making him afraid, and eventually he stopped, flanks heaving, and Lionel put the rope around his neck and stood with him. Louisa walked up to them and put her hand on the stallion's neck and spoke to him quietly, and felt his breathing begin to slow. Then she looked at Lionel over the stallion's back, and he looked at her, and the afternoon light was the kind that came in late October at a low angle and made everything look significant, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "That gate needs fixing," she said at last. "I know," he said. "I am sorry, it should have been done." "It should have," she agreed. "You could have been hurt." "I was not." "No," he said, and his voice had something in it that was different from the way he had spoken to her before, something quieter and more direct. "No, you were not. You were extraordinary." She looked away from him toward the barn. "I was doing my job," she said. "Louisa," he said. She looked back at him, surprised not at the name, which was her name, but at the way he said it, with a kind of care that she was not accustomed to receiving. "Thank you," he said simply. She did not know what to do with that. She nodded and took the stallion's lead from his hand and walked the horse back toward the paddock, and spent the next 20 minutes making sure the animal was settled and unhurt, and the gate was secured with a length of rope until it could be properly mended. And she was aware, the whole time, that her hands were not quite steady, and that this had nothing to do with the afternoon's exertion. That evening, instead of riding back to Mrs. Finch's before supper, she found herself accepting Lionel's invitation to eat at the ranch house. She was not sure when she had agreed to this. It seemed to have happened the way some important things happen, without a clear moment of decision, as though the course had simply been set and she had found herself already on it. His cook, a stout and cheerful Mexican woman named Señora Vargas, who had been with the ranch for 7 years, produced a supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread that was better than anything Louisa had eaten in months, and Lionel poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle that lived on the sideboard, and they ate at the long table in the dining room that was clearly meant for more people than were using it, the empty chairs standing around them like a quiet comment on solitude. "You have not always worked horses," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "I have worked at a good many things, whatever the situation required. And the situation has required moving, mostly." He ate for a moment in silence, the way he did everything without waste, without performance. "Do you intend to move again?" he asked. She looked at him across the table. "I generally do," she said. He met her eyes and held them. "Is that by necessity or preference?" The question was so direct and so honest that she felt something shift under her ribs, something she did not entirely like the feeling of because of where it pointed. "Both," she said, which was more honest than she had intended to be. He nodded slowly. He seemed to be thinking about something that he was deciding how to approach. "Caldwell is not much," he said after a moment, "but it is growing. The ranch is solid. I have built something here that is real." He paused. "I am not saying this I am simply saying that the place has more to offer than it might appear on first arrival." "I am aware," she said quietly. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then she picked up her bourbon and turned the glass in her fingers and said something that she had not planned to say, had not even known she was going to say until it was already leaving her mouth. "I have made myself difficult," she said. "Not by accident. I made a deliberate decision some years ago to be the kind of person who was hard to require anything of. Hard to get close to. I did it on purpose, and I have been consistent about it." She looked down at the glass. "I am telling you this because you seem like a man who should know what he is dealing with." There was a silence, not an uncomfortable one, more the kind that exists when someone is actually thinking about what has been said rather than just waiting for it to finish. "I had noticed," Lionel said, and his voice was steady and unalarmed, the same voice he used with the horses. "I noticed it the first morning you rode in. I am not discouraged by it." She looked up at him. "I am 31 years old," he said. I have had enough time to learn that the things worth having usually require patience. And I have enough sense to understand that a person does not make themselves difficult to reach without having had a reason. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to explain the reason. I'm just telling you that I see it and it does not put me off. Louisa Talbot, who had not cried in a very long time and had no intention of doing so now, felt the inside of her chest perform some complicated maneuver that she chose to ignore. You are either very patient or very foolish, she said. Possibly both, he said, and this time the smile arrived without the precursor, warm and real and directed entirely at her. She rode back to Mrs. Finch's later than she had planned, in the full dark with the stars so thick overhead they looked like salt spilled on black cloth, and she sat on the side of her bed for a long time before she lay down, and she thought about what he had said, and she thought about what she had said, which was more than she ever said, and she thought about the particular quality of his voice when he told her he was not discouraged. And she went to sleep with something unfamiliar moving around in her chest like a warm current in cold water. She finished the 7 horses over the following 2 weeks. The black stallion was the last, and by the end he would come to her hand and stand calm and still while she worked around his feet, and Lionel Boone watched this with an expression she had stopped trying to ignore. When the work was done, she stood at the paddock fence and looked at all 7 horses moving easily around the enclosure, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing well completed. I owe you final payment, Lionel said, coming to stand beside her at the rail. You do, she agreed. He handed her an envelope. She did not open it. She tucked it in her coat pocket and looked at the horses. The stallion, she said. I would call him something. They all have names except him. He has been the black one for 2 months, Lionel admitted. What would you call him? She thought about it. River, she said. He is dark and he runs and he frightens people, but he is not dangerous. He just needs to be understood. River, Lionel said, trying it. Yes, all right, he paused. What will you do now? The work is done. I know, she said. There is other work if you want it. The fence lines need riding. There is always something with a ranch this size. She turned to look at him, studying his face in the clear October afternoon light. He was not dissembling. He was not being clever or indirect. He was asking her to stay, in the only language he seemed to know, which was practical and honest and kept its heart visible if you were looking. Let me think on it, she said. Take all the time you need, he said, and meant it. She rode back to Mrs. Finch's. She thought about it for exactly 1 evening, sitting at the small window of her room looking at the main street of Caldwell, where the saloon lanterns were beginning to glow orange against the early dark. She thought about Thomas Reardon and the year she had been foolish, and the years she had spent becoming unfoolish. She thought about what she had built, the capability and the independence and the freedom to move, and she thought about what it had cost her, and she thought about a man standing at a fence in the morning light with 2 cups of coffee and the patience to wait. She went back to the ranch the next morning. She told Lionel she would stay for the fence riding, and the look on his face was one she decided she had been right to come back to see. November arrived, pulling cold air down from the north and stripping the last of the color from the trees along the creek. Louisa spent her days riding the fence lines with Pete and Walt or on her own, noting where the posts needed replacing, where the wire had pulled loose, where the cattle had pressed against the sections near the south pasture. It was good work, physical and straightforward and full of open sky, and she found she liked it. And she liked, in the evenings, the way that Lionel Boone had begun to simply be present without making demands of it. He would find her at the end of the day's work, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and sometimes they walked the perimeter of the main yard in the cold blue dusk and simply existed alongside each other, which was a thing she had not done with another person in a very long time and which she had not expected to find so comfortable. He told her about the ranch, how he had come out from Ohio in 1869 as a young man of 22 with a small inheritance and a large amount of ignorance, and had spent the following years learning what he did not know in the most direct way available, which was by getting things wrong and then fixing them. He told her about Alina, briefly and with a kind of honest grief that did not seek sympathy. She had been funny and quick-minded, and had loved the plains in a way that surprised people who expected her to miss the East, and he had loved her, and she had died, and it had taken him a long time to put himself back together. He said all of this without drama or self-pity and then was quiet, as if having said it was enough. Louisa told him about Missouri in pieces over many conversations. She told him about the household where she had worked after her parents died of cholera in 1868 when she was 16, and about learning to ride and to handle horses from the stableman there, old man Pruder, who had seen something in her that he said the horses saw too. She did not tell him about Thomas Reardon. Not yet. She was not sure why she held that back. She told herself it was because it was old history and not relevant. She was aware, in a part of herself she had spent years training to be quiet, that this was not entirely true. Thanksgiving came. There was no formal celebration at the ranch, but Senora Vargas cooked an enormous meal and the hands ate at the long table, and there was a bottle of good whiskey and someone's fiddle, and the evening had the particular warmth of people who worked hard together sitting down without their work hats on. Louisa sat at Lionel's right hand, not because anyone had arranged it, but because that was where she ended up, and she ate too much and listened to the fiddle with something approaching happiness, which was a state she approached the way Cassidy the roan mare had once approached her cautiously, testing the ground before each step. Afterward, when the hands had dispersed to their bunkhouse and Senora Vargas had retired to her quarters behind the kitchen, Louisa and Lionel sat on the porch in the cold with blankets over their laps and the stars doing their enormous work overhead, and she said, without planning to, "I was in love once." He said nothing, which was the right response, and so she continued. She told him about Thomas Reardon. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the year, the money, the waiting, the slow and grinding realization. She told him what she had decided afterward and how she had implemented the decision, and she said, "I became someone who was hard to love on purpose because I thought it was the only way to make sure I was not made a fool of again." The night was very still. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called and was answered by another. "And does it work?" Lionel asked, after enough quiet that the question felt like it had been considered from all sides. "Mostly," she said. "Mostly," he repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. She looked at him. He was looking out at the dark yard, his profile clean against the faint light, and there was something careful and deliberate in the way he was sitting, as if he was making sure not to move too fast. "I told you that first evening," she said. "I told you because I thought it was only fair. And I told you I had noticed and that I was not discouraged," he said. He turned to look at her then, and the quality of his gaze was something she did not have a wall high enough to keep out entirely, though she was aware of herself trying. "I meant that. I mean it still." "Lionel," she said, and her voice came out softer than she had intended. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight," he said, carefully and clearly. "I just want you to know that whatever pace you need, that is the pace. I have land and a house and a fair amount of patience, and I am not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You are not what I expected when I rode into this town." "What did you expect?" "I do not know exactly. Something easier to dismiss." The corner of his mouth lifted. "I am sorry to disappoint." "You are not," she said quietly, and looked back at the dark yard, and they sat together until the cold became too much and they went in. December came with its short days and bitter nights, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm of feeding and mending, and the long, slow work of preparation for spring. Louisa stayed. She did not make a formal announcement about staying. She simply continued to be there, and Lionel continued to arrange things so that she had reason to be there, and neither of them said anything definitive about what was happening between them. But the shape of it was becoming clear to everyone on the ranch and in the town of Caldwell, which was the kind of town where the shape of such things was observed and discussed with considerable enthusiasm. Mrs. Finch, who had taken a proprietary interest in the whole business from the beginning, reported with great satisfaction to the women of her acquaintance that Louisa Talbot and Lionel Boone were frequently seen in conversation of significant length. Pete told Walt that the boss seemed like a different person lately, and Walt, who was more observant than he generally let on, said that the horsewoman seemed different too, something about the way she looked when she wasn't paying attention to how she looked. There was a Saturday in early December when Louisa came into Caldwell proper for supplies, and she encountered, in Horace Prute's general store, a situation that crystallized several things at once. There were 3 cowboys at the counter, drovers who had come up on the last of the season's trail runs and were waiting out the winter in town, and one of them, a broad, red-faced man named Caldwell, had apparently been drinking since noon and had opinions about women in trousers doing ranch work, which he expressed without invitation or subtlety as Louisa came through the door. She had heard versions of this before. She was accustomed to it. She turned to face Caldwell with her Winter River eyes and said, in a voice like a dropped stone, "I did not ask for your thoughts and I do not want them. Move out of my way." Caldwell, who was large and drunk and had 2 friends watching, was not of a mind to move. He pushed off the counter and said something uglier, and the room went very still. And then the door opened behind Louisa and Lionel Boone walked in, because he had been in town on his own errand and had seen her horse outside. And he came through the door and took in the situation with one long look and walked to stand beside Louisa, with the kind of easiness that was more dangerous than aggression. "Caldwell," he said, and his voice was perfectly even the voice he used with the difficult horses. "This woman works for me and she is a guest in this town. You would do well to remember that." Caldwell looked at Lionel. Lionel looked at Caldwell. Old Horace Prute behind the counter found something urgent to do with his eyes at the ceiling. Caldwell stepped back. "No offense meant," he muttered, which was manifestly false, but was the best available exit. "Good," Lionel said, without emphasis, and moved to the counter to place his order. Louisa stood very still for a moment. Then she moved to the counter beside him, and when she reached for the paper on which she had written her list of supplies, her hand trembled slightly, which she was furious about and hoped he had not noticed, though she suspected he had because he noticed most things. They walked out together into the December cold, their breath visible in small clouds. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She stopped on the boardwalk and looked at him. The main street of Caldwell moved around them, a wagon creaking by, 2 women from the church exchanging something over a fence post, the sound of horses, and the smell of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys. "Lionel," she said, and this time when his name came out she let it be what it was, which was something. He looked at her with that quiet, direct attention that she had stopped being able to defend against. "I have been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been watching you think." I am still frightened of this," she said, because she was, and because she had decided that she was finished lying to herself about things. "I know that too," he said. "But I am more frightened," she said, and had to stop and start again. "I am more frightened of what this will look like in 10 years if I keep doing what I have been doing." He waited. "I do not want to be hard to love forever," she said. "I thought I did. I was wrong about that." He reached out and put his hand over hers where her hands were gripping the wrapped packages of supplies, and his hand was warm and very certain and stayed there. "You are not as hard to love as you think," he said quietly. "You just made it require attention, which is not the same thing." She looked down at his hand on hers and then back up at his face, and she felt that complicated maneuver in her chest again, the one she had been ignoring for 2 months, and this time she let it happen. "I think," she said carefully, "that if you wanted to call on me properly, I would not object." "I do want that," he said. "I have wanted that for some time." "Then we are agreed," she said, and if there was a slight unsteadiness to her voice she thought she could be forgiven for it, given the circumstances. He smiled at her then, not the brief contained smile she had been cataloging and storing in the forbidden part of her, but a full, open, unhidden smile that changed his whole face and made her think that she had possibly been making a very large mistake for a very long time in keeping people at a distance. He called on her that Sunday, formally, at Mrs. Finch's, which sent Mrs. Finch into a state of barely suppressed joy that expressed itself in an extraordinary amount of baking. They sat in Mrs. Finch's parlor on either side of a fire that Mrs. Finch had built to a truly unnecessary size, with tea and an entirely excessive arrangement of baked goods between them, and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, and Mrs. Finch managed to stay in the room for the first 20 minutes before her own decency drove her out. What they talked about, in those 3 hours, was the real kind of talking, the kind that establishes what a person is when they are not performing. He told her about Ohio, his family, the father who had wanted him to study law and had been disappointed, and then had come to understand. She told him about what it had been like to be alone at 16, 2 parents gone in 2 weeks, the world contracting suddenly to the size of whatever work she could find. He told her about the years after Eleanor's death, the particular silence of a house that had been built for 2 and was occupied by 1. She told him about a summer she had spent in Abilene working horses for a cattle operation there, and watching the cattle drives come in, the enormous noise and dust of them, and how she had felt, watching all those people in motion, simultaneously part of something vast and entirely alone in it. "You are not alone now," he said, simple and direct, the way he said everything that mattered. "No," she agreed, "I am not." They began to spend most evenings together, sometimes at the ranch, where the long table in the dining room had stopped feeling quite so empty, sometimes walking through Caldwell in the early dark, past the lit windows of the saloons and the quiet of the church, along the edge of town where the last buildings gave way to the open prairie that went on and on without apology. He held her hand when they walked, and it had taken her almost a full week to stop noticing that she was allowing this and simply accept that it was happening. Christmas arrived. The church held services, the circuit preacher having arranged his timing to coincide with the holiday, and the town gathered with the self-conscious warmth of people who saw too little of ceremony and valued it when it came. Louisa sat beside Lionel in the pew, which was noted by everyone present and commented upon by most of them directly afterward, and she bore this with more equanimity than she would have predicted, because she had started to find that the armor she had worn for 8 years was considerably less comfortable than it had once felt, now that she was beginning to take it off. After the service, there was a gathering at the saloon that served as Caldwell's community hall on such occasions, the drinking side of the building cordoned off with good intentions and not entirely successful results, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a mouth harp, and there was dancing. Lionel Boone asked Louisa Talbot to dance in the same direct way he did everything, with no pretense and no flourish, just his hand extended and his eyes on hers. And she took his hand and let him lead her out onto the cleared floor, and she was a capable dancer because she had learned it young, and the body remembers even when the heart is trying to forget. And they danced well together with the ease of 2 people who had already learned the more difficult dance of being honest with each other. At one point, during the slower piece the fiddler played near the end of the evening, she was close enough to him that she could speak quietly and be heard, and she said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I am glad I rode into this town," she said. "I almost did not. I was going to go further west to Colorado. I changed course on a whim, or so I thought." She paused. "I am glad I did." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "So am I," he said, with a warmth in his voice that she had stopped trying to keep herself from wanting. "Louisa, he seemed to gather himself. "I do not want to push faster than you are comfortable with, but I want you to know that I intend to ask you something important when you are ready, and I would like you to think about what your answer might be." She looked at him steadily. "I think I know what I would say," she said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said, "but ask me properly, when you are ready." The fiddler played on and the lanterns burned warm and orange, and they danced until the music stopped. January was the coldest month, the wind off the plains having nothing between it and the ranch but 40 miles of emptiness. The work was hard and basic and important, keeping the cattle fed, breaking ice on the water troughs, making sure the horses were warm enough, and the fencing had not been damaged by the winds that came in off the flat land like something with a grudge. Louisa worked through it with the same steady capability she brought to everything, and she had become, without any formal declaration, a part of the fabric of the Boone Ranch. The hands had stopped thinking of her as a curiosity and started thinking of her as someone who pulled her weight and knew what she was doing, which was the only distinction that mattered in that kind of work. Pete, who had been the most skeptical at first, had appointed himself a kind of informal ally when they rode the fence lines together, and he had seen how she handled herself in the cold with a fence post and a wire stretcher. On a Thursday in the second week of January, there was an incident with one of the cattle dogs, a young border collie named Scout, who had gotten his leg caught in a rusted piece of wire that had broken loose from the fence in the overnight wind. Louisa found him in the morning, limping and frightened, and she sat down in the snow beside him and spoke to him the same way she spoke to the horses, low and even and without urgency, and got the wire free without the dog biting her, which Pete said afterward was its own kind of miracle, because Scout had bitten everyone at one time or another. Lionel came out to the yard to find her there in the snow with the dog in her lap, the wire set aside, running her hands carefully along the injured leg to determine the damage. He stood at the barn door and watched her, and the expression on his face was one she did not see because her eyes were on the dog, but it was the expression of a man who has understood something important and is not going to pretend otherwise. That evening, by the fire in the ranch house parlor, with Scout bandaged and sleeping on a rug near the hearth and the wind doing its January worst against the windows, Lionel sat across from her and said, "Louisa." "Yes," she said. "I told you I would ask you properly." She set down the mending she had picked up. She had picked it up to have something to do with her hands, which was a strategy she now recognized herself using. "I am asking," he said. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes on hers, and there was nothing practiced or ornamental about him, just this honest and steadfast man in his own parlor asking her the most important question. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because the ranch needs a mistress or because it would be convenient or for any reason except that you are the person I want beside me for the rest of my life. That is the only reason I have." Louisa Talbot, who had made herself hard to love on purpose and had found herself loved anyway, sat for a moment in the warm light of the fire with the sleeping dog and the wind outside, and the man in front of her who had seen everything she had shown him and been not discouraged, and she made her decision. She had made the other decision at 18, the decision to close herself off, in the first real grief of her life. She had been young and hurt, and it had seemed at the time like the only possible response to a world that had demonstrated it could not be trusted. She had built her armor carefully and worn it for 8 years, and it had kept her safe, and it had cost her everything it cost a person to be safe in that particular way, which was warmth and softness and the particular comfort of being truly known by another person. She was not making that decision again. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Lionel." He let out a breath that told her he had not been entirely certain of the answer, which she appreciated, the genuineness of it, the way his certainty about his own feelings had not translated into certainty about hers. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the settle and took both her hands in his and looked at her face with the careful attention. He had always given things that mattered to him, and she let herself look back completely, without reservation, without the calculating measurement she had been maintaining since the first morning she rode down his lane. "I love you," she said, because she was going to say it first and say it clearly, so there would be no question about it. "I have been trying not to for several months, but I have not been successful." "I know," he said, smiling, that full, open smile that still reorganized everything in her chest when it appeared. "I have watched you try." It was impressive. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. He raised her hands and pressed his mouth to her knuckles simply and warmly, and she felt the quality of everything in the room change, the way a temperature changes when a window is closed against the cold, everything becoming more itself, more contained and certain. They were married in March. The circuit preacher happened to be coming through on the 8th of March, 1879, which was early enough in the season that the plains still had the gray-brown look of a world that had not yet decided to bloom, and the ceremony was held in the small church with the whole of Caldwell present, or near enough to it, that the church had not been so full in recent memory. Mrs. Finch cried with the totality of a woman who feels personally responsible for a happy outcome. Pete and Walt stood together in the back looking like men who had never learned what to do with a handkerchief. Senora Vargas wore her best dress and had made the wedding cake herself, 3 layers of spice cake with dried fruit, which she had been planning since November. Louisa wore a dress, the first dress she had put on in so long that she had to remind herself of the mechanics of moving in one, that she had bought in Wichita on a brief trip south 2 weeks before the wedding. It was deep blue, the color of the sky over the ranch at dusk in summer, and she wore her hair down for the first time since arriving in Caldwell, and the effect was something she was aware of without being vain about it, because she had spent too many years being practical to be vain. But it was gratifying to see the expression on Lionel's face when she came down the church aisle on Mrs. Finch's arm, because Mrs. Finch had appointed herself this function, and no one had thought to disagree with her. The expression on Lionel's face was something she kept with her afterward, the way you keep certain views, a sunset scene from a particular hill, a morning on a particular stretch of open land, as evidence that the world contains beauty that exceeds what you have learned to expect. The preacher said his words. They said their own words back, the old words that had been said in churches and under open skies and in quiet moments between 2 people, for as long as people had needed to tell each other they were choosing and being chosen, and those words were not diminished by being old. Louisa said them in her clear, steady voice, and felt them settle into her like something she had not known was missing until it arrived. When it was done, Lionel kissed her in front of the entire population of Caldwell, Kansas, and she let him, and it was warm and deliberate and unhurried, the way he did everything, and someone in the back of the church, she suspected Pete, made an embarrassing noise that was greeted with general laughter. They came home to the ranch that evening, in the cold, clear dark, under those western stars, and it was home. She had not had a word she could apply to a specific place in a long time, and she tested this one carefully and found it held. Spring arrived properly in April, and with it, the enormous business of a cattle ranch coming back to life after winter, the calves being born in the pastures, the horses requiring their conditioning work after months of reduced activity, the fence lines needing inspection after the winter's damage, the fields that Lionel had put in for feed crops needing their attention. Louisa worked alongside everyone else, switching between the horses and the cattle and the fences and whatever else was required, and she was good at all of it, and it was the most satisfying work she had done because, for the first time, the work was building something that was also hers. In the evenings, she and Lionel sat on the porch if the weather allowed, or by the fire if it did not, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they read. He had a collection of books that had surprised her by its size and range, accumulated over 10 years of ordering from a bookseller in Kansas City. And sometimes they simply existed in the same space in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have learned each other well enough that silence is not absence, but presence of a different kind. She had not known that this was what it would feel like. She had believed for 8 years that the price of safety was the absence of this, and she had told herself the price was worth paying. She understood now that she had been wrong about the accounting. The price of safety had not been worth paying. The price had been too high, and the protection had been incomplete. She had still been hurt by loneliness, still bruised by the absence of connection, still marked by all the years of keeping herself at a deliberate distance from the very things that would have made her life what it actually was meant to be. She told him this one evening in May, sitting on the porch with the smell of the greening prairie coming in warm and green-scented on the south wind. She told him the whole accounting as she understood it now, and he listened with the attention he had always given her, and when she was finished he said, "You found your way here." "I did," she said. "That is what matters." "Yes," she said, "that is what matters." In July she told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the kitchen, early in the morning, before the day had fully started, because she had not wanted to wait for a more arranged moment, and because she was not, at her core, a person who arranged moments. She was a person who said things when they needed to be said. He went very still for a moment. Then he set down the coffee cup he had been holding and looked at her with an expression that she thought she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen, because it contained everything joy and gratitude and something that was almost disbelief, the expression of a man receiving something he had hoped for and had not permitted himself to fully believe would come. "Louisa," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "Yes," she said. "March, I think, or perhaps late February." He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she put her arms around him, and they stood like that for a while in the early morning kitchen with the coffee getting cold, and the horses starting their morning noise in the barn, and the sky outside the window going from gray to gold. And she felt the particular quality of his relief and happiness in the way he held her, like someone making sure something real was real. The summer passed in the heat and work of a Kansas summer, the land baked and golden, the cattle fat on the good grass, the horses moving through their days with the ease of well-tended animals. Louisa continued working through June and July, moderating what she took on as the summer progressed, not because anyone asked her to, but because she was too practical to be reckless about her own health, and too invested in what she was building to take unnecessary risks with it. Senora Vargas took it upon herself to expand the cooking operation significantly, on the grounds that Louisa was eating for two and needed to be fed accordingly, and the ranch house smelled constantly of something good being prepared, and the hands benefited from this arrangement as much as anyone. In August, a letter arrived from Missouri. Louisa saw it on the table where the post was left when it came through, and her name was on it in a hand she did not recognize, and the return address was a town near where she had grown up. And when she opened it, she found it was from a woman who had been a neighbor of her family's, now aged and writing, it seemed, to tie up loose ends of her own. The letter said that Thomas Reardon had died the previous winter. He had never amounted to much, the letter said, with the bluntness of an old woman with no patience for sentimentality. He had drunk himself through most of what he had ever had, and he had died in a rooming house in St. Louis, and she thought Louisa should know because she had heard Louisa had been involved with him once, and she wanted her to know she hadn't missed anything. Louisa read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table. She did not feel what she had once imagined she would feel about such news, which had been something large and complicated. She felt mostly a kind of quiet completeness, the sense of a thing that had been open for a long time finally closing on its own. She had already done the work of putting that behind her. The letter was just confirmation that it was behind everyone else too. She told Lionel about it that evening. He listened, and when she had finished he said, "How do you feel?" "Finished with it," she said. "That is the honest answer. I was finished with it before. Now I know the ending." He nodded. He understood endings. He had had his own. "I am sorry for him," she said, because she found she was, a little, not the hot, complicated sorry of someone who still has feeling to spend, but the cool, impersonal sorry you feel for any wasted life. He was not a good man, but he was a person, and it sounds like his life was not much. "No," Lionel agreed. "Mine is," she said, and looked at him. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said, "it is." The autumn was the anniversary of her arrival in Caldwell, 1 year since she had ridden down that lane with her rifle across her saddle, and her face arranged into an expression that discouraged comment. And she marked this privately, standing at the paddock fence one morning in October while River the black stallion came to her hand and stood warm and steady beside her. And she thought about who she had been then and who she was now. And the distance between those two people was real and measurable, and she was proud of having crossed it. The child was born in late February, 1880, on a Wednesday night when the wind had gone still for the first time in a week, and the stars were extraordinary. Senora Vargas served as midwife with the competent efficiency of a woman who had done this before, and Lionel sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in a state of contained terror that expressed itself in the complete stillness he used when he was most exercised. And when the door opened, and Senora Vargas came out and told him he had a son, he sat very still for a moment longer before he moved. The boy was healthy and large and objected loudly to the world from the first minute, which Senora Vargas said was a very good sign, and Lionel came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son and said, after a long moment, "What should we call him?" Louisa, who was tired in a way she had never been tired but also, underneath that, more awake than she had ever been, looked at the small, red-faced person in her arms who was still explaining his displeasure to everyone present. "James," she said, "for my father." "James Boone," Lionel said, trying the sound of it. "Yes." He reached out and very carefully touched the baby's head with 2 fingers, the same careful, deliberate touch he gave the horses. "Hello, James." The baby stopped crying for a moment, as if listening to the voice, and Lionel looked at Louisa with an expression she would carry with her for the rest of her life as one of the finest things she had ever seen. James Boone was a determined and curious child who met the world with his mother's assessment and his father's patience, a combination that, as Mrs. Finch observed when she came to visit and bring a quilt she had been making since November, was likely to serve him well. He learned to walk early, fell down without complaint, and pulled himself back up and continued, which Pete said was the most Louisa thing he had ever seen in a small child, and Louisa said she took that as a compliment, and Pete said he had meant it as one. The ranch grew in those years, carefully and steadily, the way things grow when they are built on solid ground and tended with attention. Lionel expanded the cattle operation in 1881, acquiring a section of land to the south that had been available from a homesteader who had not been able to make the claim work. Louisa took on the training of horses for other ranches and operations in the county. Her reputation had spread in the way such things spread in a place where people paid attention to results, and the income from this added its own solid thread to the fabric of what they were building. In 1882, there was a second child, a girl they named Clara, for Mrs. Finch, who was so overcome by this honor that she brought a month's worth of suppers to the ranch and was turned away from most of them by Senora Vargas with diplomatic but absolute firmness. Clara was her brother's opposite in temperament, quiet and watchful, with her father's stillness and her mother's Winter River eyes, and she took to the horses before she could properly walk, reaching her small hand through the fence rail of the paddock toward Cassidy the roan mare, who dropped her head and permitted the contact with a grace that Louisa found moved her unreasonably. Life in Caldwell changed in those years as Kansas changed around it. The cattle drives were beginning their slow decline as the railroads expanded, and the open range was pushed back by homesteaders, and the invention of barbed wire changed the nature of the land itself. Lionel had seen this coming and had begun diversifying the ranch before it became urgent, adding grain farming to the cattle operation, and building a relationship with the railroad agent in Wichita that gave them a reliable market for what they produced. There were difficulties, as there always are in any real life. There was a hard winter in 1883 that killed a portion of the cattle and required rebuilding. There was a year when the grain crop failed to the summer drought, and they ate carefully and repaired what could be repaired and waited for the next season. There was a period when Lionel's health gave him trouble, a persistent cough that worried Louisa more than she showed, until it resolved itself in the spring and did not return. And through all of this they were what they had made themselves together. Steady, practical, honest with each other, willing to say what was difficult and to hear it. The armor Louisa had spent 8 years constructing was, in those years, entirely gone. She had not noticed it leaving. It had not been a dramatic event but a gradual process. The way ice leaves in spring, first from the edges and then the center, until one day the water runs clear and cold and free. She was still herself, still capable and direct, and not inclined toward sentimentality or decoration. But the self she was no longer required the armor, because she was no longer alone in the way that had made the armor necessary. She told Lionel this one evening in the summer of 1883, sitting on the porch at the end of a long day, James asleep inside and Clara not yet 3 and asleep also, the evening sky doing its gradual and extraordinary performance of color, going from blue to green to gold to a deep rose red along the western edge. "I used to think that what I was protecting was myself," she said. "All those years of keeping people at a distance, I thought I was protecting myself." "Were you not?" he asked. "No," she said. "I was protecting a version of myself that did not need anyone, and that version was not the whole of me. It was a piece that had decided to speak for the whole." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. And now the whole of me is here," she said. "That is the difference." He reached over and took her hand in the easy, certain way he always did, and they watched the sky finish what it was doing, and the first stars began to appear over the dark line of the prairie, and the night settled in warm and full of cricket sound and the distant call of some night bird, and it was, in the way of real life at its best, completely ordinary and completely irreplaceable. In the spring of 1884, something happened that was small in its facts and large in its meaning. A young girl came into Caldwell, perhaps 17, passing through with her family on a wagon heading further west, the family worn and uncertain in the way of people who have been traveling too long on hope and not enough on plan. She was helping her mother with the provisioning at Pruett's store, and while her mother spoke to old Horace, she stood near the door and watched the street with eyes that were not quite afraid but were carrying something, the careful arrangement of someone who had learned caution the hard way. Louisa happened to be in the store at the same time, picking up a spool of wire and some flour, and she saw the girl watching the street, and she recognized what she was seeing because she had once arranged her own face that way. She stopped beside the girl. "Are you all right?" she asked. The girl looked at her, startled by the directness. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Louisa looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "It gets better, whatever the hard thing is. It gets better, and you become someone who can handle it. And then later there is something on the other side of it that you cannot see yet." She paused. "I am not telling you this to be generous. I am telling you because someone should have told me and no one did." The girl stared at her. Then carefully she said, "How do you know?" "Because I have been exactly where you are standing," Louisa said. "And I am here to tell you that where I am standing now is considerably better." The girl looked at her and something in her expression shifted slightly, the careful arrangement giving a fraction. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. "Go west," Louisa said. "It is worth it." She paid for her goods and walked out, and she did not tell Lionel about this because it was something small and complete in itself. But she thought about it on the ride back to the ranch, with the May wind in her face and the land running green and new on either side of the road, and she thought that she had been given, without planning it, the chance to give something to someone that had been given to her, not advice, exactly, but evidence. Evidence that the hard thing was not permanent. The summer of 1884 was a good one. The cattle operation was in one of its better years. The horses Louisa trained were bringing a steady income. James at 4 was tall and sunny and endlessly interested in the horses, and Clara at 2 had formed an attachment to Scout the border collie that was absolute, and that Scout appeared to reciprocate. Mrs. Finch came to Sunday dinner most weeks, and Senora Vargas had made a kind of generous peace with this arrangement, and the table that had once been too large for two was comfortable for 5 or 6, and when Pete and Walt were included, it was exactly right. One Sunday in August, with the table full and the afternoon running long and golden through the windows, Louisa looked down the table at all of it, at James explaining something important to Pete with the seriousness of a child who has inherited his mother's directness and his father's patience, at Clara feeding bits of cornbread to Scout under the table in the transparent belief that no one could see her, at Mrs. Finch and Senora Vargas engaged in their weekly affectionate argument about the correct proportion of spice in the cake, at Pete pretending to listen to James while eating his 3rd helping of beans, at Walt quietly happy in the way of people who do not require much to be happy, but are grateful when it arrives. And she looked at the end of the table where Lionel was sitting and watching her watch all of it. He raised his glass just slightly in her direction, and his eyes were warm and certain and entirely hers. She raised hers back. She thought about the woman who had ridden into this town with a rifle across her saddle and a face like a closed door. She thought about what that woman had believed, that the only safe life was a solitary one, that love was a mechanism for loss, that warmth was something to be rationed because it would run out or be taken. She thought about how thorough and convinced that woman had been, how committed to the project of her own hardness, how genuinely she had believed she had worked it all out correctly. She had been wrong about all of it. Not about the danger had been real, and Thomas Reardon had been real, and the loss of her parents had been real, and the loneliness of the years between had been real. All of that had been real. But the conclusion she had drawn from it, that the protection was worth the price, had been wrong. It had been the conclusion of someone working with incomplete information, someone who had been hurt before she had enough experience to know that being hurt once is not evidence that love is impossible. It is only evidence that one specific thing did not work, and that the world is still going, and that you are still going with it. The correct conclusion, she now knew, was not to build walls. The correct conclusion was to become, over time, someone who could tell the difference between a man who would take her money and ride away, and a man who would stand at a fence in the morning light with 2 cups of coffee and the patience to wait. And that discernment was not a thing you were born with. It was a thing that life built in you, if you let it, at considerable cost and over considerable time. She had paid the cost. She had the discernment. And here was Lionel Boone at the end of the table, raising his glass. "What are you thinking?" he asked later, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the table was cleared and the evening had settled into its quiet. "Many things," she said, "good things. Tell me one," she considered. "I was thinking that I was wrong and that being wrong turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." He raised an eyebrow. "Wrong about what?" "About what I needed," she said. "I thought I needed to be impossible to reach. I thought that was safety." She looked at him. It was not safety, it was just loss that happened more slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking about this, taking it seriously the way he took everything seriously. "You found your way to the right thing," he said finally. "Eventually," she agreed, "with some assistance." "I barely did anything," he said. "You were not discouraged," she said. "When I told you I had made myself hard to love on purpose, you said you had noticed and you were not discouraged." She held his gaze. "That was everything, that was the whole of it. If you had been discouraged, I would have accepted it as confirmation and I would have ridden on. I was prepared to." He looked at her for a long time. "I knew it was not who you were," he said. "The hardness, I could see it was something you were doing, not something you were." "How?" "The horses," he said simply. "Nobody is that good with frightened animals unless they understand fear from the inside. And nobody understands fear from the inside that way unless they have been frightened themselves." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "I just thought that whatever had frightened you was probably not as permanent as you had decided it was." She turned her hand over and held his. "You were right," she said. I was hopeful, he said. There is a difference. Not always, she said. He smiled. No, he agreed. Not always. They went to bed in the ranch house that was their home, built solid and square with the wide porch running across its front face, and the land stretched out around them in every direction under the August stars, and everything was where it was supposed to be, and nothing was unresolved. In the spring of 1886, their third child arrived, another boy, who came into the world with the same loud opinion of it as his brother and who was given the name Thomas, because Louisa had decided, in the full happiness of the life she was living, that she could afford to give that name a better history than the one it carried. Lionel had understood this without her having to explain it, which was one of the things she had learned to treasure most about him, the way understanding traveled between them without always needing words. Thomas grew into a sturdy and laughing child, James into a serious and capable boy who spent every available hour near the horses, and Clara into someone who watched everything with her quiet intelligence and her Winter River eyes and said, when she spoke, things that were worth hearing. The years after that were the years of a life fully inhabited. The cattle drives were finished by the end of the decade, the Kishom Trail a memory and a story, Kansas settled into farms and towns and railroads, and the particular order of a place that is no longer a frontier. Caldwell itself changed, grew, became more established, lost some of its rawness without losing all of its character. But the Boone Ranch, 6 miles east of town, remained what it had always been, a working place, honest and capable, where the horses were well handled and the cattle well tended, and the fences maintained, and the table long enough for everyone who needed to sit at it. Louisa Talbot Boone, at 40, looked nothing like the woman who had ridden into town with her face arranged like a closed door. She looked like herself, still direct, still capable, still given to plain speech and clear assessment, still the person who would tell a frightened young woman in a general store that it gets better but open now, in the way of something that has found the right conditions for growing. There were lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into western sunlight, and her dark hair had silver in it that she did not mind because it was earned, and she moved through her days with the particular ease of someone who knows exactly where they are and why. She stood at the paddock fence one morning in October, 20 years since she had first ridden down the lane, and River the black stallion came to her hand, as he always had, patient and familiar, and she stood with him in the clear autumn morning while the ranch woke around her, while she heard James's voice from the barn and Clara's from the direction of the house and Lionel's step on the porch boards behind her. He came to stand beside her at the fence, as he had done 1,000 mornings, and he handed her a cup of coffee over the rail, as he had done that first time, and they stood together looking at the horses moving in the soft October light. River is getting old, he said, not sadly, just observing. We all are, she said. Not you, she gave him a sideways look. You are partial. Entirely, he agreed without apology. She sipped her coffee. The morning was cold and clear, and the sky above the flat Kansas land was that enormous pale blue that only existed out here, where there was enough horizon to let it breathe. She had been looking at this sky for 20 years, and it still did something to her, the sheer scale of it, the sense it gave of the world being larger than any one difficulty or any one person's fear. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask me. Are you happy? She said, honestly. When you look at all of it, are you happy? He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were standing close together at the fence in the October morning, the way they always stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even in the cold, and his expression was one she had seen 10,000 times and still did not take for granted. Louisa, he said, I have never in my life been more completely and simply happy than I have been since the morning you rode down that lane. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the paddock, where River stood steady and dark, and the other horses moved easily in their morning routines. I almost did not come down the lane, she said. I almost turned around at the road and went west. "I know," he said. "You have told me. I just like to remember that I almost missed all of this," she said. "It makes me grateful for it." He put his arm around her, easy and certain, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean, without bracing, without the old, complicated calculation of what it meant and what it might cost. James appeared in the barn doorway and called something about the roan filly in the second paddock that needed Louis's attention, and Lionel called back that she would be there in a minute, and James disappeared back into the barn, and Scout's successor, a young border collie called Arrow, because Clara had named him, came sprinting across the yard in the purposeful way of dogs who have things to investigate. The whole of the life spread around her in the October morning, this ordinary and irreplaceable life, built of hard work and honesty, and the particular kind of courage it had taken to stop being hard and let something in, and she stood in the middle of it with her coffee going cold and Lionel's arm around her shoulders, and felt it with everything she had. She had been wrong once about what she needed. She had spent 8 years being committed to the wrongness with great consistency. She had ridden into a Kansas border town with a scowl and a rifle, and the settled conviction that the safest person was the one who needed nothing and wanted no one. And a man had stood at a barn door and looked at her hands and been not impressed and not put off and not charmed in the empty way, and not anything she had known how to categorize, just honest and patient and entirely unafraid of the closed door she was presenting to the world. He had told her once that he had been hopeful, and she had said that hope and rightness were sometimes the same thing. Standing at the fence in the October morning, in the life they had built together, she was certain of it. She handed the empty cup back over the rail. She pressed her shoulder briefly and deliberately against his. She went to see about the roan filly that James had concerns about, walking across the yard in the clear morning light. And the day began as all their days began, in motion, in work, in the full and conscious happiness of people who know what they have because they remember what it was to be without it.